evening's program. It's a joint program with the First Baptist Church of Nobleboro and the Nobleboro Historical Society, and I'm Mary Sheldon, and I'm president of the Nobleboro Historical Society, and my role is going to be as an interviewer. This evening's program is a little different. We have invited two folks from 1793 to have a conversation with us tonight to celebrate the 225th anniversary of this church that was started when Nobleboro became a town. Mitchell Wellman is going to be videoing this, so if you would like a DVD, they will be available in a couple of weeks. So let me set the scene. The French and Indian Wars, or in a way it was the British fighting to get the French out of the country, and that war went beyond Nova Scotia and along the St. Lawrence and ended in 1763, and that'll be important in just a minute. Americans declared independence in 1776, and the Revolutionary War ended in 1783, and this church was formed just 10 years later. The year is 1793. America was in its infancy. George Washington of Virginia was just completing his first term as President of the United States and about to start his second term. John Adams of Massachusetts was re-elected Vice President, and in the second term, Washington named Maine's Henry Knox as his Secretary of War. Knox, of course, had more than distinguished himself in the state of Maine during the Revolutionary War. Later in March, Washington delivered his second inaugural speech in Philadelphia. That was the shortest speech of that type ever. It was 135 words, a nice record. In September, he laid the cornerstone of the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C., and this was a move from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. for the Capitol. In October, elsewhere, Eli Whitney applied for his patent for the cotton gin. Our country was growing by leaps and bounds. Thanks to the work of our beloved historian, George Dow, we now have organized written records of our local history. And because of George, we know that in 1793, exciting things were happening right here. George was also a beloved member of this congregation, along with his wife Myrtle and his sister Ruth. So here we find ourselves tonight back in 1793. The town of Nobleboro was less than 5 years old, having incorporated in November 1788 as the 58th town to be organized in the District of Maine within the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So we weren't a state. And this little church was on the verge of being born. Surprisingly, Nobleboro was named for Colonel Arthur Noble Sr., who was never ever in this town. He was a shoemaker and also into farming, lumbering, and shipping in what's now Phippsburg near the Kennebec River. He was caught up in a patriotic fervor to fight with the British at the beginning of that French and Indian War. And remember, the British were fighting to get the French out of Maine. Arthur Noble Sr. was commissioned a lieutenant colonel and became a hero of the Battle of Louisburg in 1745. Louisburg was an island that could control traffic into the St. Lawrence River, so it was a key location. His son, Arthur Noble, Jr., was one of the leaders in the efforts to incorporate our barely settled area into a town. Even though this battle happened 30 years before the American Revolution and almost 50 years before we were deciding to incorporate Nobleboro, it was still fresh in the minds of the settlers as they began their deliberations. So they decided to name the town in honor of a war hero, Arthur Noble's father. Obviously, Arthur Jr. was held in high esteem in the town, and in fact, he was elected first selectman and the town clerk in 1788. At that time, by law, the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts obligated each town to make suitable provision at their own expense for the institution of the public worship of God. The law further stated that the money needed for support of the preacher, any buildings, expenses, etc., should be assessed by a tax. These early lawmakers knew how important the church was as an institution in these New England towns and made Sunday, the Sabbath, a time of reflection, a release from labors, and of moral instruction, encouraging, quote, these acts of charity which support and adorn a Christian society. One of the primary reasons Noble and others gave to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts as they wished to incorporate as a town of their own was the residents were, quote, desirous of having the gospel preached to them, but they couldn't afford it. Partly because they were part of Newcastle and were paying taxes to them. However, if Nobleboro became a separate and incorporated town, the church could be funded publicly through their own taxation. Nobleboro's land and boundaries, as described in the old records, includes what is now Nobleboro and also a large part of what is now Damascotta. So those Damascotta area residents also wanted to incorporate and would all become part of Nobleboro and pay taxes for the first church ministry, which would be managed by the town. A good case was made and Nobleboro was incorporated in 1788, and just 5 years later, in 1793, 13 party souls, 6 men, and interestingly, 7 women, became the founding members who created this Church of Christ in Nobleboro, as it was originally called. Initially, taxes to support a full-time preacher were hard to come by. Many years went by with only 4 to 6 pounds in total could be allocated, so they relied on itinerant preachers traveling by wagon or horseback up and down the dirt roads of Maine. Using town taxes, the meeting house was started in 1795, but wouldn't be finished for 22 years. Another change in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts laws happened in 1800. It stated that, quote, every corporate town is hereby required to be constantly provided with a public Protestant preacher of piety, religion, and morality. And taxes, again, would support the preacher and expenses for a meeting house. So the church initially had Mr. Samuel Flagg from North Nobleboro, who had preached for several years, and then Pastor Phineas Pillsbury was hired in 1807 as the first full-time minister to preach to the 22 members of the church. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's return tonight to July 22nd, 1793. This particular tract of land was mostly an empty patch of woods surrounded by small homesteads where people struggled to survive, let alone make a decent living, and not enough tax money for the preacher or to build the meeting house. But this church was determined to grow and to flourish. We are fortunate tonight to have with us one of those founding members, Sarah Lincoln Chapman, wife of Nathaniel Chapman, who can perhaps tell us about those early beginnings. Sister Sarah.
Sister
Welcome.
Mary, I'm so pleased to see you and all your friends. My goodness.
It's nice to have you here tonight after 200 years since the last time you were here.
Well, you know, actually, unbeknownst to many people, I love to come back and visit my church family every once in a while. Now, they may not know I'm here, but I love to keep track of all these people that I have loved over the years. And I've watched so many big changes happening here. And I have to keep reminding myself that a church is not a building, it's people. And tonight maybe we'll tell you about some of these people. But our Lord Jesus Christ said in the book of Matthew, he said, even if only 2 or 3 of you are gathered in my name, there I will be in the midst of you. So I just love seeing all these wonderful changes here at our church.
Would you like to get started? Would you like to tell us what it was like in the 1700s after the American Revolution?
Well, now it was a very difficult time for us during the Revolution, and very dark days for many. But our soldiers from the Revolution who were able to returned home and started building lives throughout our country, actually. But some of us started in Massachusetts, and then we worked our way up. I was born in 1768 in Situate, Massachusetts. And as you know, as you said, Sister Mary, we were part of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And my husband-to-be, Nathaniel, was born in 1740 in Ipswich, Massachusetts. And our families learned, as many did, that there were many opportunities here in this wild frontier of the District of Maine. And so families started slowly working their way up the coast. Nathaniel and I were married in 1768 in the town of York. And then we all sort of moved our way up here along the coast. We settled actually here in Nobleboro eventually because Nathaniel's father, Anthony, had received 600 acres of land here in Nobleboro as part of the land grant. And that land was actually located farther down what you now call Back Meadow Road. And we settled there. And there we had, we built our home and had our children.
You had 8 children, I think?
We did have 8 children, which was pretty much the norm back there, and many families were much larger than that. But we did have our 8. We had 5 boys and 3 girls, and our 8th child was a boy, and I had him when I was 46 years old. So you see, we were really people of pretty sturdy stock back then. You had to, just to survive. And our family, with 8 children, we had a pretty busy home. Now, my husband Nathaniel's uncle was quite a prominent person, came here before we did. He actually was the one who built what you now call the Chapman Hall House in Damascotta. And he built that house in 1754. And then our family followed after that. My husband Nathaniel was also a builder, as well as a farmer, and we were all farmers back then. You really had to just to survive. So my husband was a builder. Because of that, we had probably a little nicer home than some of the people here in town. Many of them had little more than huts and maybe a barn or a shed nearby. And many had just dirt floors. So life was very, very difficult for everyone. And we were all really busy just surviving.
Now that's very interesting. Well, Sister Sarah, since you were one of the original 13 people who were to found this church, can you tell us how the church got started?
I can. The Church of Christ in Nobleboro. There were 13 of us who knew that it was our lot in life to start an organized church here in town. Now, as you said, Sister Mary, in 1788, when the town was established, we made a promise to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that many things, really, but one in particular, of course, is that we would establish a church, and we would have a pastor, and we would fund the church and the pastor through taxation. It was the town that voted these things in, and then we 13 5 years after the town was organized, decided that it was high time to start a church. And as you said, there were 6 men, and 7 women. I don't want to shortchange the women. Because it just pleased me so much that the women were respected and honored enough to be listed among those 13. And another source of pride for me was the fact that our older daughter, Patty, age 20, was also listed as a founder, and so was our next oldest daughter, Ruth, who was 18. And on top of all that, my husband Nathaniel was elected deacon, which was a lifetime job and taken very, very seriously. And we also had one of our founders named Elijah Dunbar, who was a Revolutionary War veteran. And we were very, very proud to include him in our midst.
Well, that was a busy time in Nobleboro. Just 50 years earlier, things had sort of gotten started in 1730 when William Vaughan and James Noble, not our namesake, developed some mills at the 42-foot drop from Damerscott Lake into the Salt Bay, and that area would become Damerscott Mills. Vaughan and Nobles and others developed the mills, and that area became a very important source of commerce in the area and thrived for decades. Around the end of the Revolutionary War, however, just 10 years before this church formed, the mills and the water rights would be owned by 2 Irish Catholic men, James Kavanagh and Matthew Cottrell. These men would become very wealthy with the mills and shipping, and they started building ships, and this would increase the tax base for Nobleboro. And much of their commerce was in Nobleboro, but a lot of it was also all the way down the river in what is now Damerscott. Things were definitely looking up. With their wealth, Kavanagh built what's known as the Kavanagh Mansion, which just sold, by the way. And that was built in 1803. And then he and Cottrell were the ones who funded the construction for St. Patrick's Catholic Church, and that was 1807, which was 14 years after your church was formed. Sister Sarah, maybe you can describe what things were like in the early church once things had started to come together.
Well, as you said, Sister Mary, we had almost no money. We were rather wealthy in land and holdings and livestock, but when it came to money that could be put toward taxation to fund a church, that was lacking for us. So for many years, we would meet in each other's homes and had some wonderful, wonderful meetings there. We were visited many times by itinerant preachers who would travel up and down the coast of Maine and come and visit us, stay with us, have meals with us, have services. And one that, of course, is one of the more famous was Elder Isaac Case, who traveled up and down, was well known up around Rockland and Thomaston, that whole area down here too, and was someone we could always rely on to help us hold ourselves together as a small church. Elder Case was an interesting man. He was not very learned. He couldn't read very well. A lot of times he stumbled over his words. He traveled on horseback. Yet, when he arrived in my house, I saw a man of God. I saw someone with amazing spiritual power. And I think a lot of people throughout the southern part of the state saw the same thing. We were blessed to have him. And then, as you say, as the town grew and the mills prospered and people moved here, we were able to kind of increase our tax base after a while. And so we were finally able to hire a full-time pastor in 1807.
And we are fortunate tonight that he is here also, our second special guest, Reverend Phineas Pillsbury.
Sisters, brothers, good to see you here in our meeting house this evening. Welcome, welcome. Sister Sarah.
Brother Phineas?
Phineas, it's so good to see you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And I'd like to pass this to you,
I've already
sir.
eaten, thank you.
Well,
I'm fine.
this
I'm
is
fine.
something you may not be familiar with.
What is that?
Well, as
Some
I
kind of
visit,
slush?
well, it could be. As I visit this church from time to time, I see all these new developments and the lighting, of course, and everything else, much nicer than the candles we had. And so this is something that has been invented to help project your voice, sir.
Well, a Baptist preacher doesn't need any help in that area. I'm sure.
We know.
Okay. I'll keep you happy there.
Well, thank you.
All righty.
Brother Phineas, could you tell us what it was like to be the first full-time pastor of this church?
Yeah, I started in 1807 and was here for about 30 years or so. As I heard you say, I was on the town dole. I was paid by the town, along with the hog reeves and the tithing men as well. So I was one of the town employees.
What was that?
Yeah, I'm seeing some curious looks on faces. Hog reeves? You don't know about hog reeves or tithing men? Well, back in the day, you had your hogs, right? And those hogs were let to roam so they could feed on the mast, the acorns, and what have you. And hogs don't pay any attention to fences or boundary lines, and so they might get into Sister Sarah's garden or something like that. So what would you do? You would call the hog reeves to come and restore the peace. So that's what hog reeves did. Tithing men were also on the town dole, and they maintained the Christian morality in the town too, and helped us to keep tabs on things like swearing and dancing, card playing, that sort of thing. The church monitored those sorts of things as well. Blasphemy, maintaining the Sabbath. The Sabbath was a day that we just rested. You know, you went to church and then just rested and stayed home with your family. So any transgressions there would need to be dealt with as well. One of them, I remember, was our own Deacon Daniel Hall, who tried to cross Deep Cove in the middle of the winter, and his horse and cart broke through the ice, and he had to be rescued. So he was teased and chastised by the town as well, because his horse fell through the ice. That's a sad thing to happen anyway, but if it happens on a Sabbath, particularly challenging. So there's that. Questions of adultery as well. So I remember once in July 7th of 1816, we called forward a young man and a young woman in the congregation who had been caught in adultery and challenged them with their transgressions and asked them to confess, and they did. Fortunately, the woman did quite well, and 15 months later she was married to a man in the congregation. The young man did not fare so well and went on to repeat and was no longer a member of the church. So those were some of the things that we did. I said I was on the town dole, started out at about $50 a year. In 1807, by 1819, it was up to $350 a year, my salary was. So, but I did my gardens too and that sort of thing. So I remember baptisms, very proud of the baptisms. We had 351 during my tenure year here, 351 baptisms.
That's a lot, too. They still have baptism that like that now? Or?
They do, but we have become a little bit soft as Baptists, as I understand it, and only baptized during July and August. I think you still baptize in Vaughn's Pond, or you call it something else now. What is it that you call it? Damascotta Lake. It was Vaughn's Pond back in the day. We baptized 12 months of the year. If somebody came to the Lord and wanted to follow Christ, we would go out and chop a hole in the ice if it was February. We would build a fire there by the shore. One of the deacons would come into the water with me so I could have assistance, and we would baptize. I hope you know what baptism is. It's one of our most famous ceremonies. After all, I mean, we are a Baptist church, right? So what we do is someone who commits to following Christ, we lower them into the water and then raise them back up out of the water. The lowering or going down symbolizes a death, and the lifting back up symbolizes that they come to new life. As the Apostle Paul himself said, don't you know that all of you who are baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? We were therefore buried with him. This is a scripture that says this, okay? Through baptism into death, in order that just as Christ was raised from the dead, so we too might be raised from the dead to the glory of the Father, and also may live a new life. So, let's see, baptism's preaching. That's a big thing, right? I did a lot of preaching twice on a Sunday. Sometimes during the week, too, I would either walk or get on horseback and go to people's homes and preach around. It was hard to get around back in the day. Didn't have these horseless carriages that you have now that whiz you around here and there. So I would go to them. Sometimes I would tarry, meaning that I would spend the night if it was at a distance and could not get back to my own home in time. Visiting the sick, conducting funerals. Do you remember that funeral that was 1817, I believe, in February? A young man and his wife, Jefferson, and their 3 children died in a house fire. So that was a particularly tragic situation as well. But I think it's pretty much the same thing that the pastor would do now in the church. For sure.
I heard that your sermons were sometimes pretty long.
And that's a problem. I mean, church was a big event back then. There were no distractions or anything like that. The Sabbath was a day of rest, of focusing on God and his meaning in our life and all that he blessed us with. So, yeah. Both the Sunday morning and the Sunday evening sermons
May I
would be
add
long.
just a bit? Excuse me, sir.
Oh,
Those sermons, I can tell you, were extremely long. It could be 5-6 hours, if he was on a roll. And so a lot of times, if we were at our homes, that would be one thing. But once we had built a meeting house, which we'll talk about a little later, it had no heat. So we had to endure 5 or 6 hours of freezing temperatures with children and blankets and all the rest. So, but we loved Elder Phineas anyway. But yes, I am a witness to his sermons, definitely.
Yes, this is a beautiful sanctuary that you have here now. The one that I preached in is no longer standing. That was completed in 1817. Part of the way in which we raised money for that building would be to sell the pews. So each pew was owned by a certain family. Sometimes, even now when you go into churches, you'll still see a little number there or something. So each family would buy a pew. You could decorate it a little bit as you wish, put down a little bit of carpet, maybe a little bookcase, sometimes even a hat rack. There would be maybe a few hat racks springing up around the congregation. But that's how ushers got started too, because if you had a visitor that would come, that visitor should not be seated in a pew that was owned by somebody else. So the ushers had to keep in their mind which pews were owned and then seat the visitors in unclaimed pews. So I understand now that people can come freely to church. I guess it makes sense. I mean, God's love and grace are free, so freely come, right? But back in the day, that was a way in which we raised money to complete the building of the church and to support it.
So you were here until 1817?
No, I started in 1807 and I left in 1836.
Ah.
And I have a question. And there's quite a story about how Elder Phineas left the church, why he left, and so forth. And it's a pretty interesting one. And I think it would be better, possibly, if he tells you that story.
Well, what happened was there was a problem in town, and that was alcohol. It was demon rum, to be sure. alcohol pretty much permeated society. Sometimes people were even paid with rum or would drink on the job. You know, the employers would provide the alcohol. That was a part of the benefits of work. And so alcohol was becoming quite a problem. There was really too much of it. So there began a movement among our churches here in Lincoln County to temper that use or abuse of alcohol. I believe it became known as the temperance movement. And a pledge came forward to the churches that churches were asking their members to abstain from alcohol. And so that was about 1829. And it finally came around here to Nobleboro and came to a vote here in late 1835. And I told the congregation that I expected a unanimous vote for the temperance pledge to abstain from alcohol, and if the vote was not unanimous, I would leave. And so the vote was taken, and the next Sunday I had to resign. The church voted in favor of alcohol, and rather overwhelmingly. And so, but Baptists believe in soul liberty. That's one of our hallmarks, that the individual can really make decisions for themselves. So I understand, but I was disappointed. Preached my farewell sermon, I believe the first Sunday in 1836, and I was gone.
Well, I will add, since I was part of the group of people who voted at that particular time, that there were lots of reasons for this. And I can only speak for myself, not for everyone else. But I felt that we had just fought a horrible war, winning our freedom, our liberty of choice. And we all knew that alcohol was a problem, but we also had to keep it at home for medicinal reasons too. A lot of times we had to do our own doctoring, and so we were torn. You know, first it was rum that we always kept at home, and then later on hard cider. I think the problem probably came down to we just didn't want to be given an ultimatum. You know, we knew it was a problem. We just didn't want to be told, do this or I'm gone. And unfortunately, Elder Phineas felt very strongly about it, as well he should. And therefore, we voted against him. We didn't support the petition, and he did feel that he had to keep his word and leave. That doesn't mean we didn't love him and respect his wishes greatly. We just were disagreeing, I think, on the manner.
But you did go on to support it, and women were great leaders in this movement as well. I understand that women, again, stepped up to the plate, so to speak, and did amazing things here in the state of Maine.
Well, we really did. As women, especially, we just knew the problem was a big one. We would go to so many, barn raisings and social occasions, and the first thing that would happen is, the rum would be broken out, or the hard cider. And people started acting in very, let's just say, unwise ways, doing stupid things, unsafe things. And I would have to say it was probably more the men than the women, although there were women who misbehaved too. But we thought, this is wrong, and therefore, as time went on, the church did vote to, after Elder Phineas had left, we did vote to support the petition. And I think we kept a little clause saying, we'll keep it for medicinal purposes or whatever. And also, we were very instrumental in the whole women's temperance movement. And you've often heard, I'm sure, of the Women's Christian Temperance League. This was a very active area for that. We held meetings all over southern Maine. And we women were very instrumental in following the whole temperance movement from beginning to end, really.
Well, that's an interesting story. I think that the temperance is something that people could still think about now. It's still an issue. There are other things that were going on about the time that Pastor Pillsbury was leaving. Even though Maine had become a state in 1820, when Reverend Pillsbury was there, the taxes still supported the Baptist Church. That didn't change, and the meeting house was used by both the town meetings and for the church services. But as other Protestant faiths like the Methodists and the Congregationalists developed in town, the competition and complaints caused the town to stop the ministerial tax in 1835. That's the same time that Pastor Pillsbury left, but that wasn't the reason. It was that other vote. And so in 1835, the town dissolved their direct connection with the Baptist Church. That's the only church that they were supporting. And in 1838, right across the road here, the town built another town office, but as you noticed, I'm sure that's not there anymore, and it's now down the road in the other direction. So the church then had to raise their own finances, and initially members were assessed a church tax based on their property valuations. According to George's history book, there was some lagging in spiritual enthusiasm when that happened. And in 1871, it was agreed the church changed to voluntary subscriptions. But Pastor Pillsbury, perhaps you can talk about some of the defining moments of your service here in the church.
Oh, yeah, there's several. I think one year that really sticks out in my memory that was particularly challenging would be 1816. It was just an astounding year when there was either ice or frost or snow every month of the year. Even June, July, August, there was either ice or snow or frost. I remember very clearly writing in my journal on July 10th, 1816, that ice was made tonight as thick as a window pane in the bucket, that I left out from my horses. I mean, in July, ice in the water. And as you can imagine, that really was horrible for our crops. Most of the families, if not all of the families, raised their own food. You either grew it or you bartered for it, one or the other. So church members were just desperate and in great concern. So the next Sunday after I wrote that in my journal on July 18th, we convened a fast here in the church. Fast meaning a kind of a time of intense prayer where you forego food and drink just to be able to concentrate on the task of praying. And so we just gave ourselves to praying and just cried out to the Lord that He would save us. We did not know what we would do. Fasting occurred at other times too. Every January 1st we would have a fast and we would beseech the Lord for the new year, that God would guide us into the new year. There were other things as well. I remember in talking with some of my successors as well, 1888 was quite the year when dear Charlie Oliver was found dead out in front of the church here. He was a young man in the congregation, a good Christian man. Post-mortem was done on the body and found out that it was alcohol that had killed him, and he died in a snowbank April 1st, right in front of the church. Just in returning for this special event this evening, I actually even visited his grave out on, there was no road back in the day, but then it became the Butter and Egg Road here in Nobleboro. I think you call it something else now. What is it? Vanna Road, yes, the Oliver Cemetery there, where he is buried. Just a young man that we lost. I think all we can figure out is maybe some rowdies in town were plying in with alcohol, which would, come to think of it, make it murder, wouldn't it? I mean, because they took his life. So it was a very serious thing. I think some of the other defining moments would be how we started churches around the area too. Many churches in this area really look back to us as the mother church or as the one who gave birth to them. The first would have been in 1819. We started the Second Baptist Church. This is the First Baptist Church, right? In the big town of Nobleboro. There was a little village down the way here that had a few houses and barns in it. But we started the Second Baptist Church there, and now I think it's called the Damascotta Baptist Church. So that was 1819. 1836, this being the First Baptist Church and now having a Second Baptist Church, 1836, we started the Third Baptist Church, which I think you now call it the North Nobleboro Baptist Church. 1841, then there was a Baptist church that was started down in the Mills too. It's now a private residence. That's a little bit hard for me to get my mind around, but I'm sure they dream of angels every night as they go to sleep there in that church. And then we have the South Vestry as well, down toward the Biskie Road and Biskie Pond down there. There was a meeting house. Because you see, like I said, your horseless carriages whiz you around everywhere now. But back in the day, you needed a church in your community that you could get to easily. So thus all these small churches around were started up. The South Vestry was another place where we had preaching and so on. We eventually sold that building. I can't remember who bought it, but we made sure that there would be no dancing. We would sell them the building, but no dancing was to take place in that building. So those would be some of the defining moments. They were good years.
Yeah, the church really went a long ways. The Baptist church was really prominent in this area. But there was another interesting religious happening in Nobleboro about 35 years after you left, and you went on to serve in other Maine churches. But the Methodist camp meeting in Glendon started in 1872 and ran for 36 years until 1908. Glendon is in Nobleboro, and it's right across what's now US 1, across from the Nobleboro Antique Store there. But it was a 9-acre grove that was back close to the railroad tracks. And these camp meetings were part of a period of religious revivalism and evangelism that spread throughout the colonies among the established and the new Protestant sects in the mid-1850s. Initiated by a Methodist minister from Philadelphia, William Osborne. This revival camp in Nobleboro was run by the Rockland District Camp Meeting Association of the Methodist Episcopal Church. I'm not sure why they came all the way down to Nobleboro for it. The meetings were held during the first week in September, from Monday through Saturday. Admission was only 10 cents, and that was enough for the whole week, and that covered the costs of all of the programs, too, for that time. And there were substantial buildings constructed. There wasn't just tents and flimsy buildings. There was a 2-story Lincoln Hotel with a dining room that seated 250 people. It had a great kitchen. Every room had running water. There was next door, or just down the road, was the Temple Hall. It was 80 feet by 50 feet. It could seat 1,000 people. And it had a 50-foot tall tower. It had a 300-pound bell and outdoor seating for 1,200 to 1,500 people. In 1888, when the temple was built, it cost $2,600, a substantial amount. And the streets were laid out in this grove. It was a center street, a north street, a south street, and water had been piped in for all of the buildings that needed it. On the grounds, in addition to the camp meeting buildings, there were religious buildings for different churches, there were commercial buildings, and some families constructed very substantial 2-story residences that they would live in during the camp meetings. The social side of things sometimes seemed to overwhelm the religious purpose. There were people who would paint your portrait, there were barber shops, there were a photographic saloon, and there was even a horse trading headquarters in the Waldoboro Woods that was just east of the campgrounds. At times, the newly constructed Knox and Lincoln Railroad would make 12 stops at that Glendon station. And there were as many as 7,000 people on site on those grounds some days. Some attendees would stay in the grove, or they would stay at local homes, and they would board their horses too. So it was a big financial boon to Nobleboro. And since the camp meetings were just 1 week a year, other groups were allowed to use the campground facilities, and that was the Women's Christian Temperance Union that Sister Sarah had mentioned. There was a Knox, Lincoln, and Sagadahoc Sunday School convention there. The Good Templars met there, and other religious groups besides the Methodists. It was a really busy place with lots of horse and buggy traffic and a big local financial benefit. When the camp meeting stopped, the buildings were dismantled or moved. The Temple Hall was said to become the Opera House in Port Clyde, and many farms still have outbuildings that were part of the camp meeting, and some homes had additions that were part of the camp meetings. And this was just a few miles from this church. Sister Sarah, do you know if the Baptist church went to any of these activities on the campgrounds?
No, I don't believe we did. As I come back and forth visiting, I've looked, and I don't believe any of our people did attend their particular services. However, we did use their facilities, I believe, once in a while. As you say, Sister Mary, for the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And there were times when our Sunday school children would use that area as a camp or, a parade ground. The place was huge, and so we were very fortunate at least to use it a little bit, not a lot.
Well, Sister Sarah, can you tell us a little bit about how the church changed since after Pastor Pillsbury left?
I can. First of all, I want to emphasize the fact that we had built our first meeting house. That's not this building. It was a building nearby, most likely, although no one's quite, I guess we can't remember really well. It was just a large, unheated building, but it was also used for town fairs because it was financed by the town of Nobleboro. And so that building we used, it was completed during Elder Phineas's time here, and right on through until he left in 1836. When he left, I would say we felt pretty lost for a little while. I think we wondered if we had made a huge mistake in voting the way we did. But it wasn't long before the Lord provided us with our second most well-known pastor, and that was Elder Enos Trask. And he was just a wonderful, wonderful person. And we felt lost for a while, and then all of a sudden we were found. And this man led us from 1836 to 1849. And he was a farmer also, very well known here in town, and built his own home here, lived here, raised his children here for quite some time, and then left and actually moved to the Jefferson-Whitefield area, where he was just as beloved there as he was here. He preached there as well. He helped build the Trask Meeting House, which I believe is still thought of as their Baptist church in Jefferson. And he was also one of the selectmen in town. Just a wonderful, wonderful person. And there are many Trask relatives still living in this area to this day. So we managed fairly well.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of changes to this building too, as the church changed. Because originally, wasn't this just all one long building?
It was. Now, the first, as I say, we used the building that we finished building in 1817. We used that for many, many years. And then, of course, as the town grew, and our membership grew, and the numbers of baptisms grew, we needed more room. And we had also separated ourselves, as you said, Sister Mary, from the town itself. So we were now supporting ourselves. And in 1855, we dedicated this particular building. And as you say, now it didn't look like this exactly. There was no bell tower, no vestibule there. It was a fairly simple, large building, This wall did not exist, so we just had one huge sanctuary, which we filled with our people Sunday after Sunday, and it was just wonderful. And I've seen some other changes as I've come and gone, and I'm going to need some notes for those because, well, you know, if you're 274 years old, you know, you really need a little help with the memory.
I think if I can help you out there, we had 2 entrances here.
We did.
And there were 6 columns out front.
We
And
did.
we put in this beautiful bell tower. What year was that? The bell tower?
The bell tower went in 1889. However, just before that, we purchased our very first parsonage as well, which was another bright spot for us. And we purchased the house which is diagonally this way, beside what you call now the village store. And it was used as an antique shop and so forth, and lived in privately for quite some time after that. But then we were following by 1889. We repaired the roof here, which needed a lot of work. It had been over 30 years. We added 2 new wood stoves in the back, one on either side of the sanctuary here, and we ran wood stove pipes along each side of the ceiling. And those furnished not only the stoves, but also the stove pipes furnished some warmth for us, which we were really grateful for. As we were saying, in 1889, the vestibule out front was built, and the bell tower was built, and the bell was installed, and it was installed by Austin Hall. This bell weighs 1,250 pounds. It was cast in 1889, and on the bell is inscribed the following phrase: "Let all the people praise thee, O God, let all the people praise thee." And that bell has been praising God all these years.
I think I hear it now.
I do believe you do, just like magic. So in 1922, another big deal for us, we installed a wood-fired furnace down in the basement, and all of a sudden we were becoming very fancy. And then in 1938, we did partition off and built this wall, partitioned off the room which is right behind the sanctuary now, because we didn't need quite so much seating. There was also a choir balcony in the back, which we removed to make just a little more room for everyone. And in 1938, that room in back was dedicated to Mrs. Clara Carter, who was just a lovely wife of one of our pastors, Pastor Lyman Carter. In 1941, you know, every church has its ups and downs, and we were having some problems with money. In 1941, we were forced to sell our parsonage there, and we needed to just pay off some debts. You know, there was no getting around it, so that building was sold. But our doors here never closed, not once. And in 1961, we were able to purchase a brand new parsonage, new to us, and that's the house now that is on this side, diagonally from our church, across the street. And as I say, we purchased it in 1961 for a price of $13,500.
You bought it from my granddaughter, didn't you?
That, well, I'd love to hear you explain that.
Yeah, Lizzie Pillsbury Perkins was the owner. That's the Perkins home, and so yeah, that was my granddaughter. So I'm glad that it stayed in the family.
I think that was probably unbeknownst to the church members at the time. Just a happy, very happy coincidence. In the early 1970s, we received a gift of a large camp building that was 30 feet by 50 feet, a camp building from Clary Lake in Jefferson. And the building was cut in half and moved here and attached very slowly to this existing building because we needed educational space at that point in time. And so that building, and it took quite a few years. Mostly it was the men of the church who worked on that. They did a beautiful job. And the upper part of that building, if you stay with us and enjoy some refreshments, you'll see that room. We call it the parlor, but it's really the Palmer room. And down below is the room where we have all our church suppers, if you've ever come here to those. And that is dedicated to Joseph Chapman, and we call that the Chapman room.
I think that the wife of one of the people who helped to connect that is here tonight. Was that Mrs. Keene?
Oh,
yeah.
I believe so. I think her husband Wes was one of the ones, and I'm almost guessing that possibly Abby Peck worked on that building as well. Yes, absolutely. And you know, as I said earlier, church is not the building. I mean, this building has been lovingly cared for so many years. Just amazing when you think about it. For a small town, not a wealthy town, this building is just a treasure for all of us. And the people, you know, like Agnes and Wes, are the ones that we always love to think about here. If you look at those blue hymnals in front of you, you'll see the names of people, you know, all the people that donated those hymnals and took such a great interest in this place. And two of the most special people that we always love to think about are George and Ruth Dow. And I know you all are very familiar with them. George was a member here of this church for many, many, many years. I almost think he used to sit where Agnes and I, Vern, are sitting, but it was in that general area. He just did so very much, not only for the town, but for this church as well. And Ruth, of course, taught Sunday school. She was superintendent of Sunday school. Education was her thing, many of us, many people, let's say, remember her flannel graph stories that she loved to tell to the children. And she would love it when the children would gather around her. Myrtle, of course, was right there with Ruth and with George for so many years.
And Ruth did the library, too, and we still have quite a library here.
We do, and if you do join us out back, which we hope you do, there's going to be a library in the back corner that is dedicated to Ruth Dow. We have some of her books, and her love of learning goes on. And the book collection just grows and grows, and we think of her all the time.
Well, thank you very much. That brings us up to the current time here. And now you folks know a little bit more about early Nobleboro and about this church and its 225-year history. One of the more recent happenings here is that we have Pastor Stan LaQuire, who was arrived on August 1st in 2016 from Philadelphia with his wife Colleen. And he has enjoyed learning more about the fascinating history of Nobleboro and the First Baptist Church of Nobleboro, and enjoyed planning this presentation with Carolyn Baltus and me. And celebrating 225 years of history with this program and other programs that we've had earlier through the whole summer. So congratulations are due for reaching this amazing milestone. The Nobleboro Historical Society is pleased to be a neighbor and celebrate with you all. This church is 225 years old, the First Baptist Church of Nobleboro, that started as a slightly different name. And the state of Maine now is only beginning to plan its 200th anniversary, so we're definitely ahead of them. And as has been mentioned, if you would like to join us now for refreshments in the back parlor and have a chance to share some of your memories and stories about the church, by the way, you'll pass a restroom on your right, the light's on the outside, not inside. And in addition to cookies and coffee and punch, there's some historic items from the church that have been labeled, and they're all spread out so that you can look at them. And there's a booklet that George Dow wrote about the history of the church, and if you haven't seen it or if you'd like to buy one, those are there too. And the Historical Society has also brought some things. So thank you very much for coming tonight, and please come and join us.